Alright, ladies and gentlemen, for this presentation we're going to talk about the abiotic factors in an environment. So we're going to talk about the things that make up an environment that are not alive. That's actually what this A in front of the abiotic means. It means not alive or non-living. Frequently when we study biology, we think about it as mostly the study of living things, and that's exactly what it is. But sometimes that study requires us to take a look at what and where the living things reside. And so we need to, when looking at ecology and environmental science, take a look at the non-living factors that influence living things. And you can see from this diagram that those non-living factors can take up many forms. Obviously you have rain, which includes stuff like, rain in the water, which is both. Sunlight's a big deal because that's the primary source of energy, and we're not going to talk much about energy in this presentation, but energy is going to be a big deal because all living things require it. Wind is actually a weirdly important thing because it helps move water, it helps change the temperature, but also it is responsible for allowing a lot of plants to spread themselves all over the place. That's actually another thing that's not on this that should be brought up is temperature. Hot, cold, how much it stays, how consistent it is. All those things are really important. And then also the soil. The soil is sort of a catch-all for like the minerals and stuff that are inside the ground. All right, so all those things are really important when trying to understand the factors that go into play when living things are surviving. Now what we really want to talk about are focus on three different things: water, carbon, and nitrogen. Now all living things require water to survive. In fact, living things in essence are just sacks of water if you live above the land, or if you are a sea creature, you live in the water. No matter what, water is a fundamentally important solution for living things to exist in. Without it, chemical reactions don't take place. Carbon is really fundamental because all living things are made of organic molecules. And one of the things we talked about when we discussed our organic molecules is that carbon is how you define organic. If a molecule has a lot of carbon in it, it's considered organic. And that means that things like carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, all of those require carbon in large amounts. And since living things require those molecules, living things require carbon. Nitrogen is a less common element that we discuss specifically, but it's heavily involved in nucleic acids, which we will discuss at great length, and it's heavily involved in proteins, which we've already discussed. And the thing about nitrogen is that nitrogen is one of those 6 most important elements to life: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur. And so making sure that we have enough nitrogen is a key aspect of getting living things to survive in an environment. And so one of the things we want to focus on in this presentation is that the environment will actually take these 3, and we're going to use these 3 as examples, there are others as well, and cycles the materials through the environment. So basically the environment is a big giant recycling plant where everything that we need gets used, broken down, reused, broken down, used, broken down, reused, broken down. It's a big cycle that living things flow through. And so the first one that we want to take a quick look at is the water cycle, or what's called the hydrologic cycle. Hydro, the prefix, generally refers to water, okay? And basically what you have to understand is large percentages of the planet are water. Well, most of it are sort of unusable to land creatures because there's salt in it, and we require water that has a low salt content. But the water that's on the planet actually is constantly altering form. Water has, 3 forms like everything in nature: solid, which you think about as ice, which isn't really a big deal in this cycle, although, snow is part of that. It has the liquid, which is what you generally can think of when you think of water. And then there's also a gas, which is water vapor. Okay, so most of the water on the planet is obviously in liquid form. So what happens is heat from the sun causes that liquid water to evaporate. Water that's used by plants actually gets given off in small amounts, so it also evaporates in a process known as transpiration. And as that water goes up into the sky, the temperature gets colder. And as it gets colder, that water condenses, which means it goes from gas to liquid, into clouds. Now, eventually those clouds get so full of condensation that the amount of water in them is too heavy, and you end up with precipitation, which is when the water falls back to the ground. And that happens obviously everywhere. Sometimes plants will take that water up, sometimes animals will drink that water, but ultimately what happens to that water is it ends up running down the land back to a body of water. And what happens is, as that water runs down, it ends up back in the ocean, in the plants, and it ends up evaporating again, or it ends up transpirating again. And that's why water is a cycle. You go from liquid to evaporation, to condensation, to precipitation, to runoff into bodies of water. It's, relatively simplistic, but it's sort of important to understand that the key thing here is heat is what allows this to happen. Too much heat and the water can't condense. Too little heat and the water never evaporates. So the right amount of temperature is important, and that heavily controls where we find water, where we find droughts, and in fact, it changes the way wind flows, which moves the clouds and changes precipitation. It's a very complicated process, but interesting nonetheless. Now, in addition to the water cycle, we also have the carbon cycle. Now, the carbon cycle is a complicated thing because carbon cycle is really about how carbon runs through living organisms. So the majority of carbon on the planet is in this form, carbon dioxide. And it's in the atmosphere. And living organisms need to be able to get that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And so the number one way they do that is this process of photosynthesis. And plants do photosynthesis. They take that carbon and they turn it into sugar and other organic macromolecules. And then you have organisms that eat the dead plants and stuff, and they call them, some of them, detrivores. They actually, decompose. Actually, we're going to go with that word. They are decomposers because they come in a lot of forms. Detrivores just being one of them. So they're decomposers who just break down living organisms that are dead. So they're recapturing that carbon. Then you also have animals, all right, which are capturing that carbon when they eat plants or when they eat animals that eat plants. And then they give off this process known as respiration. And what they do is they give off carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Well, plants also do this process, respiration. So they give off carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And, that's a cycle. Now, the problem is that right now, we are burning, see this fossil and fossil fuels? So animals that never really got decomposed but ended up trapped underground, a pressure over millions of years turned them into a liquid, which we call oil. Well, that's carbon that never really returned to the atmosphere. So what we're doing is, using through our cars and factories and electric plants, we're actually giving off that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So we're adding extra carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And that's a big problem because it creates something that we commonly refer to as the greenhouse effect. If you've ever been in a greenhouse, you know that it generally is much hotter in there than other places. A better example is if you've ever gotten in a car on a sunny day. You notice that the inside of the car is much warmer than the outside. And that's because when sunlight travels through that glass, some of it gets trapped inside the car and it heats the car up much more. Well, that's what carbon dioxide does to our atmosphere. And so what we're doing right now is we are putting more in and getting rid of plants so they don't have as much to take out of it. And it's a vicious cycle, and that's where we get this massive problem of global climate change. And it's interesting, with something like the water cycle, we're always concerned that we're not going to have enough fresh water for all the organisms on the planet. But with the carbon cycle, we're never worried about not having enough carbon. That's not really the issue. It's that we're using too much and just putting too much back into the atmosphere. And it's just piling on a little too much for the planet to maintain an environment that we can live in. Finally, we have the nitrogen cycle. And now you can tell by this diagram the nitrogen cycle is complicated. So the first thing to understand is that the majority of nitrogen on this planet is in the atmosphere. Okay, that's a big deal. The majority of nitrogen on this planet is in the atmosphere. And we have sort of complicated ways to get it out. Because unlike carbon, we don't, plants just don't take it out. All right. So what has to happen is you need bacteria that live on the roots of plants that can actually, we refer to as nitrogen fixing. And basically what they're able to do is just extract nitrogen from the environment and turn that nitrogen into something that the plants can use. And then the plants actually are able to use that. Decomposers can extract the nitrogen from the plants. Animals can extract the nitrogen from the plants. You even have bacteria in other places in the soil that create nitrogen in ways that the plants can use. And then finally you have bacteria that takes all of this nitrogen when there's too much and give it back to the atmosphere. So this is a cycle that requires an intermediary. Okay? It actually requires the bacteria in the middle to get the nitrogen to a form that's usable. That's the key thing to take away from that. Okay, we need the bacteria to keep it to a form that's usable. All right, those are the basics of 3 examples of abiotic cycles that are necessary for living things in the environment.